Hello, good evening. Zimbabwe is a laughingstock. Zimbabwe is apparently the most miserable country in the whole wide world.
Next story, let's talk about misery. They say misery loves company, and these days, miserable countries have lots of company. The distress of some is off the charts, but just enough to quantify. We're talking about the misery index. It has analyzed 157 countries and ranked them in order of how miserable they are. Zimbabwe has topped the list. It's a country in Africa home to about 16 million people. It has topped this list for 3 straight years now. Where does India stand? At number 103. And how is this list created? What can countries learn from it? Our next report tells you.
Misery finds most company in Zimbabwe. This African nation is home to about 16 million people, and it has been named the world's most miserable country. But we aren't saying this. The misery index is. It is formally called Hankey's Annual Misery Index. How does it work? It's an economic index. This index analyzes 157 countries, then gives a score to each of them. This score is based on unemployment, inflation, bank lending rates, and percentage change in GDP. This year's index has now been released, and top of this honor roll is Zimbabwe. The index blames the country's political turmoil for this. It says that Zimbabwe is mired in corruption. This has only aggravated a deepening economic crisis, and its troubles don't end there. Violence is rampant and widespread. Tens of thousands are descending into poverty. So, all this doom has made Zimbabwe the gloomiest nation to live in. Who's next? Venezuela, Syria, Lebanon, and Sudan. For Syria, it's their unemployment that is making it miserable, not to mention its horrific civil war, which has been on for over a decade.
Here we have it. One can deny that these things are not happening in Zimbabwe, but those who are at the coalface, the ordinary Zimbabweans, will tell you that life is truly a miserable life. Their existence is a miserable existence. How did we get here? I think we can analyze it, but I think one of the starting points is with the decision to wage the armed struggle. It was the beginning of our troubles. During the fight for India's independence, the story goes that the Indian nationalists were given the option of waging an armed struggle to end British rule. Gandhi and the other leaders argued that what kind of leaders would an armed struggle throw? And the follow-up question is, would those be the kind of leaders who would want to lead India? Their decision was no, and so they did not wage an armed struggle. I don't think Zimbabweans, if we had a chance of asking the same question today, it would be very foolish to agree on an armed struggle. Because it did throw leaders who, as the country's independence became more certain, they began to assert themselves. And by the time we held our first elections in 1980, it was clear Zanu PF, Mugabe and his Zanu PF friends were convinced that they had the right to rule the country. They had earned the right to rule the country because they are the ones who liberated, who ended white colonial rule. And as they are victorious revolutionaries, they had the right to decide who rules the country, and they were going to rule the country. For the 1980 elections, Mugabe and his cronies went to the Lancaster House conference, and they tried to argue that Zimbabwe should be have a one-party state, but that obviously was a lead balloon that never took off. And therefore, then they were forced to accept a multi-party democratic constitution. And on the way back to Zimbabwe, they had already hitched a plan. At the Lancaster House, it had been agreed that all armed combatants were to be withdrawn to assembly points. Zanu PF saw to it that many of their armed combatants did remain in the bush. Some were withdrawn, yes, but many of them remained. And their campaign for the coming election was very simple and very clear. If Zanu PF does not win the election, the bush war would continue. So there we are. Any hope of the people having a meaningful say in the governance of the country was there and then forgotten. Many people have argued that yes, they had to do that because they could not trust the British and the white Smith regime to run free, fair, and credible elections. But that argument has since been disproven by the facts on the ground. Because, yes, the 1980, the people voted to end the war. And as soon as Zanu PF got into power, the number one priority was to consolidate their hold on power. And if anyone had hesitated, had any doubts that the regime meant what it said when it said that if it didn't get what it wanted, it would resort to violence, that notion was quickly dispelled. Because 3 years later, Robert Mugabe launched the now infamous Gukurahundi massacre. The principal purpose of that was to force Joshua Nkomo and his ZAPU friends to abandon the party and join Zanu PF. And this they did by putting pressure on Joshua Nkomo and his colleagues and decimating their support base. In 1987, Joshua Nkomo relented, gave up ZAPU, signed the so-called Unity Agreement, creating Zanu PF. And the merge of the two main liberation armies created the space that Mugabe wanted to impose the de facto one-party state. And the rest is history. Yes, maybe before I leave that point, it should be said that Zimbabwe was not the only country that had an armed struggle to end white colonial rule. Other countries like South Africa had Umkhonto weSizwe and still had leaders like Nelson Mandela who were committed to upholding the rights and freedoms of all citizens. And he did. His legacy to South Africa is that he left the country with a truly democratic constitution, with healthy and functioning democratic institutions. Whether this will last for much longer, given what has happened in the last 30 years, remains to be seen. But the fact still remains that he did deliver that. Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe and his Zanu PF colleagues had no intention whatsoever of delivering that. They wanted to replace the white colonial oppressors with themselves. They wanted to be the new rulers, and they were not willing to compromise on that. And they did not compromise on that. And they've ruled the country with an iron fist. Zimbabwe is a failed state because ever since our independence, we have failed to run free, fair, and credible elections. We've been stuck with a corrupt and tyrannical regime that did not care about the suffering of ordinary people, that did not care about their freedoms and basic human rights. All they cared about is that they should have absolute power and they should enjoy the economic benefits from it. And so the looting that this video was talking about has been going on for the last 43 years. During that time, during the last 43 years, we did have the opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. And the best opportunity, without any doubt, came during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. By 20 years after independence, it was clear to most Zimbabweans that the country could not carry on the way we were going. We needed to implement some democratic change to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. And the people then risked everything to elect Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends on the understanding that the party would implement the democratic changes to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. Sadly, as we say in Shona, Takatuma bete kumukaka. MDC had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. They failed to implement even one meaningful reform because Zanu PF or Robert Mugabe specifically had bribed them with the trappings of high office, the ministerial limos, the very generous salaries and allowances, the $4 million mansion for Morgan Tsvangirai, and MDC guys forgot all about the reforms. And so the opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship was lost. We are where we are because we have failed ourselves. Everything that has happened, even the first decision to go to wage an armed struggle, in the final analysis, is that it was a bad decision. We should not have made that decision, gone down that route, or at least we should have taken precautions to make sure that Zanu PF would not turn the gun on the liberated nation and demand that they become the new oppressors, which they did. So it was a bad decision. The decision to risk everything and elect Morgan Tsvangirai and company to implement the democratic reforms were per se a wrong decision too. We should have been more careful than elect people who were so easily corrupted and forgot about the reforms. In fact, these elections we are going into are a waste of time. MDC, Triple C guys have completely given up the fight for reforms and free and fair elections. They are now fighting for the few seats that Zanu PF gives away to entice the opposition to participate. And of course, they will not admit that. So they claim that they've got winning in the elections, in rigged elections strategies. And they've been claiming that since the 2013 elections, 2018, and now 2023 elections. Of course, that's all hot air. Zanu PF is rigging these elections. And by participating, MDC, Triple C are just giving the regime legitimacy. And that's perpetuating the dictatorship. And that's perpetuating our misery. I think we need to put on our thinking hats to believe that we can win rigged elections is the most idiotic argument I've ever heard. So we have now abandoned the rational position of let's implement the democratic reforms to ensure free, fair, and credible elections. For this idiotic idea that we can win rigged elections. In other words, Zanu PF has got the right to rig, and we have got to do our best to make sure that we win those rigged elections. This is a vicious cycle. Even if Nelson Chamisa and company were to win these 2023 elections, and we have not done anything to end the case of rigged elections, I can tell you now that Nelson Chamisa is not going to implement any reforms. So the next election in 2028, we can expect many of the irregularities and illegalities to still be there. If Chamisa had survived until then, he would expect you'll be looking to ZEC to deliver him a second victory. And he's not going to reform the system when he can see this time it's working in his favor. So we will be only perpetuating the system that has brought us so much misery. The most rational thing to do for people of Zimbabwe right now is, for God's sake, put on your thinking cap on and accept that as long as Zanu PF is able to rig the elections, there will be no meaningful political and economic change. Zimbabwe will remain a failed pariah state. And so let's bite the bullet and say, no, we want the democratic reforms implemented before elections. By refusing to participate in these elections, by denouncing Nelson Chamisa and company for participating in these flawed elections, we will be sending a clear message to SADC that, number one, we, the people of Zimbabwe, accept that the 2008 to 2013 GNU was a golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms and set Zimbabwe on a democratic path. We wasted that chance, and we have only ourselves to blame for it. However, we believe that we cannot carry on with these meaningless, flawed elections. And by denouncing the process itself and denouncing CCC for participating in this flawed process, we'll be sending a clear message to SADC leaders themselves that there are Zimbabweans out here who can see what went wrong in 2008, 2013, and are prepared to make sure that, given another chance, another GNU, we will implement the democratic reforms and put Zimbabwe back on a democratic footing and give ourselves finally a chance to elect a regime that is accountable to the people and set the requirements for good governance. Those in public office must be accountable, democratically accountable to the people. And that we can only achieve by ending this case of rigged elections. We are prepared now for a new GNU whose primary task will be once again to implement the democratic reforms. And that primary task will be carried out diligently this time. Zimbabwe does not have to be a miserable country. It has got so much going for it. Our biggest problem in Zimbabwe for the last 43 years has been the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. That has been the number one failure for the country. I think we can put it right. Now we know that our failure has been the failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Let's focus on that. Let's make sure we reject this carry on of participating in flawed elections only to give Zanu PF legitimacy and perpetuate the dictatorship and perpetuate our own misery. The way forward is there. The way out of this mess is there. We just need to open our eyes and our minds and grab it. If Zanu PF is granted political legitimacy after these 2023 elections, then we will have failed ourselves. And I can rest assure you, we can be certain that our misery will only get worse. The economy will not revive as long as Zimbabwe remains a pariah state. And as the economy becomes more and more unstable, people's desperation will increase. We'll see more and more of our people trying to leave the country for greener pastures elsewhere. And in the present economic situation, there will not be that many countries that will be welcoming. And therefore, then, the nation will be even more stuck. And God knows what could happen next. The solution is there. We just need to open our eyes. The solution has always been there. We should have never accepted an armed struggle because we should have known that there is a risk of the armed struggle throwing up leaders who will only be interested in replacing the white colonial regime as the new oppressors. And that is exactly what has happened. We should have been more careful in risking life and limb to elect Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends, when they turned out to be so corrupt and incompetent, they failed to implement even one meaningful reform during the 5 years of the GNU. Worse still, if we had our eyes open, our minds open, we would have seen that MDC guys sold out during the GNU and we should have stopped following them blindly, which many of us do to this day. This is not rocket science. Zimbabwe is one of the most miserable countries in the world, not because we have got a problem of resources. We don't. Zimbabwe has got an abundance of resources. The big thing that we have lacked these last 43 years is competent leadership. And good leaders come from the people. We have lacked a competent electorate. And as long as we continue to follow blindly, Zimbabwe is not going to get out of this mess. Zimbabwe will continue to drift into more troubled waters. We have been the most miserable country in the world the last 3 years running. Even if somebody was to take over, Zimbabwe will still remain in the top 5 miserable countries in the world for generations to come. At best, if we don't open our eyes, we can have another mediocre government, which will only be interested in having their share of the loot, instead of the rich abundance of minerals and potential farms, good farmlands, and so forth being the blessing. These things are becoming a curse, because this is from the looted wealth. It is the looted wealth that Zanu PF is using to bankroll the party's elections and thus keep themselves in power. We can stop this madness by being firm and decisive on reforms and demanding that Zanu PF should not be given legitimacy after a flawed election process, even with the participation of a discredited opposition. It is within our reach. And I think as a people, we really need to put on that thinking cap on plus. No one is going to do the thinking for us. We have to do it ourselves. And if we do not want to stop and think, then we deserve to suffer. We will remain the most miserable country in the world for not only the next 5 years, but for generations to come. That is the grim reality. That is the food for thought that I think I would like to leave with every Zimbabwean out there today. Good night.